On February 24, 2022, Russia's President Vladimir Putin initiated a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Since then, the supernation is fighting a brutal war to defend their homeland and repelling the Russian invaders. This act of aggression is one built on misinformation and personal ideology by Vladimir Putin in an attempt to incorporate Ukraine as a part of Russia. But his plan is failing terribly. The initial assumption of a 2-day invasion has evolved into a full-fledged war which has lasted for over a year and a half now. Due to fatal mistakes by the Russian military by failing to establish reliable supply routes and neutralizing Ukraine's air defense systems, the intruders were quickly driven back. As a result, the conflict has evolved into a near stalemate, with both sides depleting their resources. Putin realized that he could not possibly win this war with just military measures as long as Ukraine retrieved steady support from Western nations. This led Putin to pursue tactics beyond classic warfare and expand the war to other countries. By destabilizing democracies in Africa and the Middle East, fueling a hunger crisis and flooding Western countries with refugees, Russia is enforcing a crisis on multiple continents and creating a new form of a Cold War to weaken its Western enemies. Let's look on a map to understand how Russia is influencing other countries outside of Ukraine in order to benefit their war efforts. The member countries of NATO have been and still are the primary enemy of Russia and seen as a big threat by Putin. Even outside of NATO, every European country condemned Russia's attacks, with the exception of Belarus, who is a Russian ally and was even involved in the invasion efforts. Other nations that are considered allies of Russia are found in Asia, like Syria and Iran. From the beginning of the war, Russia tried to weaken its former European trade partners by cutting oil and gas supplies, which led to rising energy costs and increased fuel prices. But over the following months, most European countries managed to substitute their demand with other trading partners and stabilized the energy crisis. Many nations are now no longer dependent on Russia's energy supplies, and Putin's attempt to use energy as a leverage to plunge Europe into darkness and cold for its support of Ukraine has ultimately failed. In July 2023, Russia withdrew from an agreement that had previously ensured the safe transit of Ukrainian wheat and corn exports through the Black Sea. This weaponization of food, as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken calls it, is further fueling a global hunger crisis and is mainly impacting poorer countries in Africa and the Middle East. Moscow has indicated that it will only consider rejoining the grain agreement if Western sanctions targeting its food and fertilizer exports are eased. Russia's own grain exports are benefiting from the Ukrainian export blockade, which is potentially contributing to its war expenses. Besides Russia's impact on food stability in Africa, it has gained political and economic influence on the continent over the last few years. Many African countries are not powerful enough to get involved in an international conflict between superpowers, so many did not condemn the war in Ukraine officially. Putin is taking advantage of that and is trying to unite African nations against the West and strengthening his political influence. In 2020, Russia was ranked Africa's biggest arms supplier, and the country offers military training and mercenaries to countries like the Central African Republic. In return, Russian companies retrieve licenses for the mining of gold and diamonds. The Russian private military company Wagner Group takes an active part in shaping governments in Mali, Mozambique, Sudan, and the Central African Republic. Many of these countries are unstable democracies or were part of a wave of coups that washed over the continent in recent years. It is difficult to prove Russians' involvement in all of those coups, regardless of the extent of Wagner Group's involvement. They are welcoming the new military regimes in power, which offers them even more influence on the continent. Those coups also play into the hand of Putin's plan to draw Western eyes off the war in Ukraine. Destabilized democracies combined with a hunger and climate crisis is resulting into a mass movement of refugees to safer countries, mainly the European Union. Back in June of 2021, Russian ally and dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, threatened the European Union that it will be flooded with drugs and migrants. It seems to be in the interest of Russia to destabilize Western nations with an overwhelming number of refugees. With already over 5 million Ukrainian refugees dispersed throughout Europe, the sentiment to accept additional migrants from Africa and the Middle East appears to be waning. In the meanwhile, the European Union Council is challenged with introducing new migration laws and preventing a refugee crisis at their borders, while hosting millions of Ukrainian citizens who fled from the war. Besides the food crisis in Africa and the migration crisis in Europe, the recent reawakening of the Israel-Palestine conflict is further contributing to this polycrisis, how political experts call it. A polycrisis is caused by many different problems happening at the same time, so that they together have a very big effect. The attack by the Hamas terrorist group on Israel has reignited the conflict in the Middle East, resulting in the highest number of civilian casualties in decades. The atrocities committed on both sides are fueling violent protests in Europe and are diverting global attention away from the war in Ukraine. This situation benefits Russia, which is telling Western leaders that they should have focused on the Middle East rather than interfering with Russian affairs in Ukraine. Russia has known connections with the Hamas terror group, with delegations visiting Moscow several times and talking to Russian officials. It is not unlikely that Russia supported an attack by Hamas as a means to place Western nations in a difficult position, forcing them to decide between continuing military support for Ukraine or supporting their long-standing ally Israel. Hamas is reported to have received financial and military backing from Iran, a historical adversary of Israel. Additionally, Russia has strengthened its ties with Iran, as both countries face challenges due to Western sanctions and perceive the West as a common enemy. Moreover, this conflict aggravates the migration crisis, adding more pressure on the European Union. It also distracts the Russian population from the president's war efforts, all the while demoralizing Ukrainian society as they fear losing international support. To conclude, after Putin realized that he will not win the war in Ukraine due to the strong support by Western powers, he needed a polycrisis to destabilize his enemies. A new Cold War against Europe and the US at the cost of innocent individuals, shortening food supplies and destabilizing democratic systems in Africa to flood Europe with refugees. On top of that, an escalation of the Israel-Palestine conflict was deliberately pursued to trigger a massive wave of refugee displacement and forcing the West to decide whether they will send financial and humanitarian aid to Gaza or to Ukraine. This, in turn, forced a decision on allocating military resources between Ukraine and Israel. The world has its eyes on the horrendous war crimes in Gaza and Israel now, and no longer on the Ukrainian soldiers who fight to defend their homeland. Powerful nations now must decide which war they want to support. But as long as Putin is further fueling crises all around the world, these conflicts will not cease to exist.